Good morning. Today we are celebrating the Feast of Thanksgiving. So you may have noticed that this wasn't from Matthew, this gospel wasn't from Matthew, who we have been hearing from, but from Luke. I'd like to begin by telling you a story but when I was in seminary. Two things. First of all, in seminary, there's lots of talk about praying and how to pray well, pastoral care conversations. And we learn pretty early on that there's a very big difference between curing and healing. Curing is when you are cured of something and that disease or that whatever is no longer in you, right? It's a cure. Healing is when no matter what is going on in your life, you are made whole. And as Christians, we believe that we are made whole by being in good relationship with God. So, often, if I am praying over someone, I will say, God, please heal them heart, mind, and soul. Because the physical healing is really up to God. Now, I know that we say, ask, knock, and it will be given to you. And so I'm not saying if you pray for specific things, there's anything wrong with that. Sometimes our hearts just yearn for something like that. But we also believe that it is only God who truly cures. But all of us can help each other be well. If you're a doctor in the audience, life work is about curing. We need people to facilitate that for God. But in this gospel reading, there is an assumption that God cures. So, when I was in seminary, we had a requirement that we had to be immersed in another language for 2 weeks. Now, I gotta tell you, in my undergrad, I did Italian, and I am terrible with languages. Not a little bit bad, like terrible. 4 semesters, A's and A minuses in all of them, and I failed completely the listening exam at the end for proficiency. I have no ear for languages. I wish I did. Keep trying. And I barely passed the speaking part. I think they were being really nice to me. 100%. I mean, I totally passed the writing and the reading. So I asked my advisor, what about culture? Can I go into a completely different culture? And I said, can I immerse myself for 2 weeks in poverty? And can I see what that's like? And will that fulfill that requirement? And I was lucky. He said yes. So I went down to the Cape and spent 2 weeks, 1 week, in what they call townships. And these are places that have been placed away from people, big populations, with very little resources. But then I spent a second week with this wonderful woman named Patrice, who was part of Hope Africa. And Hope Africa is very much like Episcopal Relief and Development. They supported things that helped in disasters and in development. And so I'm so blessed. I was touring around and I met this woman, and she was running a church in the Cape. She told me this story. She was elected to be the vicar, because this is more of the Anglican tradition, so the rector of a church. And there were men that were outraged because there was still that thing about hiring a woman as rector, that thing, right? Anyway, so she was very faithful, and there was a house right near their congregation, and it was a mess. It was what we would call a flop house. When I say a mess, imagine the absolute worst. So she got this idea, and she got some men on board, those same 3 men that really didn't want her to be there. She got them on board, and they bought this house, and they renovated this house, and they made it into a hospice for AIDS patients. Now, this is in 2005, and this is when whole generation was getting wiped out by AIDS. Literally, people were dying, whole generations. The reason I was there in the first place was to learn from these 2 women who were teaching teenagers how to parent their younger siblings, because there were no moms and no dads to do it. And so they built this. It's a hospice. They built it. Nobody came. And people in that area were so sick with AIDS. But nobody came. And let me tell you, in South Africa, the area I was in, which was very poor, if you were rich, you got 3 meals a day of mealie meal. That's like a porridge. If you were not rich but okay off, you got 2, and if you were poor, you got 1. That's the kind of poverty we're talking about. And so they built this, no one was coming. And then someone from their church got cancer, and he needed to go into hospice. And so he went to her and he said, "If I have cancer, can I go there? Or is it just for AIDS?" And she was like, "No, it's a hospice. You can go there." He went there. And as soon as he went there, the rooms were filled, because the stigma of the AIDS was lifted. Because then no one knew whether you were going there because you had AIDS or because you had cancer. So guess what happened? People got better. And I don't know that many of us know this. There's something in our government that gives huge amounts of aid, financial aid, to countries like South Africa who have this problem. And so they had all the medicine they needed. They just needed the will of the people to admit that they had AIDS and would take it. Well, guess what? This hospice had the medicine. So they also had 3 meals a day. So people who went there ended up getting healthy because they were eating better, and they were taking the medicine, and so then they got convinced what the medicine did, and then they were leaving hospice because they were fine. As fine as you can be, right? Were they cured? No, they still had AIDS. But were they well? In so many ways, yes, they were. Imagine that. Just imagine. That is good news. That is a church in action. That is God being part of that group to put the solution to an unbearably heart-wrenching problem. And so when I left there, they were buying another piece of property, or they bought a second property, and they were building another house so that the kids could be in the house next door while the mother, was recovering and getting stabilized. This is good news. And why do I preach this today? The stigma of AIDS is equal, I believe, to the stigma of being a leper in this gospel. In this gospel, the lepers were put aside. They had their own people. And what was crazy is it was skin diseases. It wasn't even necessarily anything that was threatening, but it was contagious. And not just contagious, and also getting Hansen's disease, but it was contagious where you wouldn't be pure. And if you weren't pure, you couldn't be in the community. You couldn't worship. You couldn't go to the synagogue. You couldn't be with your people. And in many ways, the belief then was you couldn't be with your God. When Jesus heals these 10 lepers, the reason why they are good and obedient and are making their way to the priest is so that they can be purified and they can then once again be in their community. It's beautiful, right? But that one leper was different. And this is Jesus' point to us. That one leper was different because he didn't belong to that community anyway. He was a Samaritan. It didn't matter if he was made clean or if he purified himself. He still was never going to be in that community. And so that wasn't what was on his mind. That wasn't his outlook when he got healed from this leprosy. What was on his mind was, only God could do this, and I need to thank God. I need to be with God. And the closest for him with God was Jesus. So he goes back to Jesus, he prostrates himself, lays down completely on the ground. There is no more humility than that. And he says, thank you. Thank you, God. His outlook was different. He had a chance to be cracked open because he wasn't interested in the status quo. I think we have an opportunity when we experience those times in our lives when we feel whole or we are made whole, either by a restoration of a relationship, or if we can finally calm down from anxiety. In those moments, we have the opportunity to change. And how do we change? By our gratitude. The gratitude is the place that can pivot us from resentment to gratitude. From a broken relationship to a healed relationship. From being sick of heart and soul to being healed in heart and soul. Gratitude is probably the most powerful thing that we have the ability to do, is to be grateful. Everything can change when we go from scarcity, resentment, anger, fear, into gratitude. I often hear people say, I am fearful and resentful when I think that I am not going to get what I want, or someone is going to take something I have away from me. Does that make sense? Can you identify with that? I'm often resentful when either I'm not going to get what I want, someone's standing in the way of what I want, so they better get out of the way, or I have something and someone's trying to take it away. And whether it's imagined or for real, it doesn't matter, right? What's the antidote to that? Be grateful for what you do have. Open your eyes and look at it. Look at what you have that is a blessing from God. And the last part is, believe that God will give you everything you need. And for some of us, we get what we want too. That's the cherry. God will give you what you need. Stop worrying about it. Live in gratitude for what you have. Something that happened to me most recently is I was on a trip and I was visiting my daughter. And as a mother, I finally garnered courage to ask her if she and Jack were going to have kids. I know, right? And you know what? Jacqueline said we're not. We're not going to have kids. We've made that decision. And so, boy, did I feel sorry for myself. But I practiced this. I started to think I could get all wigged out in my head about this and ruin my relationship with my daughter and my son-in-law. Or I can be just grateful for them. And so now I practice being grateful for my relationship with them as it is, and not how I think it should be or wish it was. And it is amazing and beautiful and fun. And this is all about God. All about God. So, practice gratitude, especially in those areas where you think or feel that resentment or anger are seeping in. You can wipe them away with a grateful heart. But always, and I mean always, remember that all good comes from God. And everything we have, God blesses us with. Happy Thanksgiving. I hope you all have a fantastic time around that table with no matter who it is.